Hi everybody and welcome to the webinar today. Our title for today's webinar, How to Cut Time and Disk Space for Database Provisioning by 99%. First of all, just a couple of introductions to get us started. For those of you who aren't familiar with Redgate, Redgate is a company that's now 18 years old. We were actually lucky enough to celebrate our 18th birthday this week, which involved all of us going outside and having a very odd picture taken, which I'm sure you'll see on the website very, very soon. Redgate has over 200,000 customers currently using our tools, and with around 4 million website visits each year. And of those customers, 91% of Fortune 100 companies are actually using our tools. So we have a huge reach. We have many, many different products in many different areas that all kind of support users working with the Microsoft SQL Server database platform. And today we're going to speak about a particular area of that. To introduce myself, my name's Tom Austin. I'm Head of Pre-Sales Engineering here at Redgate Software. I've been at Redgate coming up for 10 years now, and really my focus is helping organizations to bring DevOps practices and processes to the database. Many times we see very rich DevOps pipelines in place, but often the database can be forgotten. So I work with many of our customers in all different areas to make sure that actually the database doesn't become the bottleneck. And I'm joined today, and we're very lucky to be joined today, in fact, by my colleague, Richard McCaskill. Richard, do you want to tell us about yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Yes, I'm Richard McCaskill. I'm a product manager here at Redgate. I've been with Redgate about 2.5 years now, but before that, I had getting on for 20 years experience in financial services, IT, the insurance service market, and latterly hedge funds. I've been on the journey that a lot of our customers have been on, finding better ways of working with databases over time, working with teams, working with databases, trying multiple different solutions, and I'll tell you a little bit about that later. I hope that's going to help inform some of the discussion that we're going to have today.
Excellent. I'm really excited to hear all about it. So Richard, let's start off. I mean, our title today is really all about costs, right? So we're talking about how we can cut the time and energy spent on these provisioning tasks. But when we're talking about costs, I mean, are we really referring to just people's time and the hardware involved? I mean, what's really the cost that's apparent when we're talking about provisioning? You've done this before, right?
Yeah, I have. I was a provisioner. I was a database provisioner, like many of our customers, writing scripts to deliver database copies into the development and test environments, managing UAT and the differing requirements that people doing acceptance testing have, that people doing automated testing have, of good quality, high fidelity copies of the data that your code is actually going to be experiencing when it gets through the software development lifecycle. And of course, the time it takes to copy a database is a factor. The money you have to spend on disk space to support an ever-growing number of environments. DevOps leads us towards separating out concerns of different kinds of testing, different kinds of integration. These costs are all real. Time that the DBA spends organizing it, disk space that has to be found, that has to be provisioned, possibly from another team. I think one aspect that's often ignored is the multiplying effect that delaying a team has on a project.
Okay.
So I think you've got to think about the cost in a slightly bigger perspective, that there is a cost to holding up a team. If getting everything ready for the work to take place is that time that elapses between a decision to act, a decision to write some code, to address a customer problem, to deal with a production fault. If provisioning is the gap between that decision and value being added, starting to get into that process of adding value for the end user, for the business user or customer, then there's more to it than just the time of copying a database. You're asking often developers to go and find something useful to do while you get a refreshed copy. And that cost of reset, the cost of rework, all adds up. So I think I'd encourage people to think slightly bigger than the cost of actually buying a disk or the cost of actually copying a database.
Yeah, so I guess what you're saying is you've got those hardware, you've got those obvious expenditure costs, you've got time as part of that as well, but there's a cost to the work that hasn't been done. as a result of waiting for this process to complete.
That's right. Yeah, there's an opportunity cost. There's the time that you're not working on the thing that's fresh in your mind, and each time you have to reset. Each time you have to go back and say, well, we need to go through that process again. We need to evaluate that software change again. We need to experience the applications working with the database to reproduce that customer scenario that caused a fault last time.
Sure.
Each time you need to go back, you're paying again. You're paying distraction cost, and you're disrupting a team, not just a team effort. Which and getting focus is pretty expensive as well. If you've worked with any group of people that is concentrating on a task that's got a deadline, the interruption that provisioning can cause, it can be pretty costly.
Okay, so I mean, I guess you've outlined a few different areas there where there's a necessity to provision. I mean, you've spoke about creating environments where we can do a bit of testing. I think one of the key ones was when you want to add some functionality. So we're talking about development environments here, creating development environments so that people can quickly start making code changes. Is that what you're implying?
That's and all the others, but yeah, absolutely, yes. The development environments are key. If you want to parallelize the work that you're doing, then it quickly becomes pretty difficult to work together in an environment where changes are occurring, and the changes are not necessarily occurring at the pace that you want them to occur.
So what we're talking about here is moving towards this kind of shared versus dedicated environment. But I just before we move on to talk about that in a bit more depth, I just want to slow down one moment because we haven't spoken yet about the compliance requirements. I mean, how do they add cost to this process?
Well, we've been looking into how people do database provisioning for a little while here at Redgate. We did a survey that's available on our website, very interesting survey about database provisioning, and we found, according to our survey respondents, 72% said that they copy production databases for non-production uses. Now, you tell your compliance officer that, you tell somebody tasked with data privacy, share that piece of information with them, and you might have a slightly awkward conversation.
Yeah.
Not all organizations have customer data, not all organizations have sensitive data, so it's not absolutely everybody. But the regulatory changes that are happening at the moment are encouraging all organizations throughout the data using industries to think long and hard about it. Are you using data in a way that is that has been consented to?
Yeah.
Or do you have to perform some operations in order to make that data safe for that usage? So and most people would again we asked people about whether they used scripts. A very great number of people, was 35 to 40% off the top of my head, have scripts to sanitize their data. But even if you don't need that, in your organization, and as I say, you're being encouraged to think about it, you probably need to do something else. You probably need to swap out permission sets, for example, for those lower environments. If your production logins work in the development environment, that's probably not great. If your development credentials work in the production environment, that's definitely not great. So your permission sets are going to be different. Sure. Your configuration data is very likely to be different. And remember, segregating environments is part of compliance as well.
Yeah.
So, the ISO 27001, for example, is very clear on this. Segregated environments are required. Many other control objectives in other regulatory frameworks have the same kind of requirement. So changing your database to make it suitable for that particular use is another cost and another thing that you need to consider when you're looking to optimize the use of databases, the use of high fidelity production-like data in your non-production environments.
And I mean, we're talking about the cost of compliance here in terms of all those steps that you're saying we have to go through, but actually the cost of non-compliance is about to get much more expensive, right?
It is, and this is all effectively a risk assessment. The cost optimization has to meet risk assessment at some point. So the cost of non-compliance is high and is about to get much higher, as we all know, because of the GDPR. And I know most of us have been bombarded with GDPR-related, slightly far-fetched marketing and something. it's 4% of turnover is 20 million euros as the maximum fine, for the most egregious, breaches of responsibility. But just having that there, at the same time as recognizing that that's not going to happen on day one for every little mishap. On the other hand, that is being held out there. The legislation is intended to be dissuasive. The penalties are intended to make people sit up and think at the board level about whether people in their organization are doing the right things with data. So on the one hand, you would think that would suggest, let's stop using data, let's stop using in our development and test workflows. But I would suggest that an awful lot of people are quite committed to this and see a clear value in it, given that it's painful, given that it's expensive. 72% are still doing it. They clearly recognise the value, and I would say the value of encountering production-like circumstances early in your process is really at the heart of DevOps, and it's no coincidence that people like the LMAX Exchange, where Dave Farley and Jez Humble wrote the continuous delivery book.
Yeah. Copied
databases into the dev environment from an early stage, but they wrote sanitization scripts. They took control of the process, and I think it's really about this: taking the right amount of control while minimizing costs and maximizing quality through exposing software to production-like situations,
and being able to evidence the fact that you've taken steps to make sure that the data is safe and the data is okay to put in that environment.
Absolutely, it's not just about doing the right thing; it's about being seen to do the right thing.
Okay. Well, let's hop back to this idea that you kind of brought up of this shared versus dedicated environments. And I mean, I work with Redgate customers who work in a range of different ways. So let's look at these in detail one at a time. So first of all, the shared environment. So this is where there's one single development database that each of the development team are working against, and then any changes from there are committed to their source control repository. Now, you told us as part of the introductions, you've got real world experience of being in organizations that have these processes and practices. Have you worked with an organization that used this approach?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I've worked with multiple teams and different situations. And with teams I've worked through, really what is the right thing for us. And I don't think there's always a right answer. That we might have a preference for certain reasons, and I'm sure we'll uncover some of those. But the shared environment is a natural first step. I don't think we should get away from that. It's if you need to make changes, if you're a very small organization, especially, you need to make changes. The coordination isn't necessarily that difficult on the changes that you're making. Then this is a low cost way of doing it. You restore a copy of production, you run the script if you need to run it to sanitize it to make it safe, and then you're good to go. You need a mechanism for controlling how you promote those changes into the higher environments, but this is a perfectly reasonable starting point.
Yeah, and I guess it also means that there's with all those concerns, and you said that we mentioned on the previous slides about being able to evidence that you've taken the necessary steps. The fewer environments that you have to look after, the fewer databases that you're creating, it's much easier to be sure that you're taking the right approach with those, right? It's much more visible.
I think it is in certain circumstances. So if you know that you've got your changes are going to happen in a strict sequence, that you're going to make a change and then you're going to evaluate it and then you're going to deliver it into a production environment. If you don't have coordination to do because you've got one person or two people doing it, then yes, these things make sense. But there are other concerns that start to weigh against this approach, which grow over time and complexity. And the certainly scaling the organization, scaling the complexity, having the ability to do work in parallel.
But you're not ruling this out, right? You're not ruling out the shared environment. You're saying it requires a lot less disk space. The DBA finds it easier to manage because there's less databases, essentially. And, security is less of an issue because you can be very focused on the areas that you're working in. So, this doesn't sound that bad. I mean, why are people then moving? Why are people having to drift away from this? Or is it a desirable thing?
I think it is desirable because it gives you flexibility. It gives fundamentally your business has got some options on how it scales its development work, how much development work it's going to do, whether development work gets delivered in sequence or whether that sequence can be changed, whether you're how many different versions of a change you want to be able to test, manage, maintain. So I think you start to get pulled towards the dedicated environment when your business needs to do any of these things, or your business wants to know that it's capable of doing these things at some point in the future, and also when you want to work as a team in a more efficient manner. So if I have a change to make on a database schema in order to support my application change, I would rather see that work through to the end and gain some confidence as somebody writing some software that is the right change, or as a business analyst or as an IT manager. I want to gain confidence quickly. If I'm having to coordinate multiple different changes that could potentially impact each other, then my ability to gain that confidence is compromised.
Okay, so you're saying it's a scaling thing. It's as you want to deliver more faster, you're going to need more people working in parallel, and therefore you need some form of separation. But you also want that confidence of being able to have your own isolated environment where you can work specifically on the task that you're looking at.
I think when you're working with databases, you're in a fundamentally unfair position in many ways.
Right.
An application developer sitting with Visual Studio and some code linked into the Git repository has their own sandbox, effectively.
Yes.
They can hit it till it works.
Okay.
They can write bad code, then lousy code, then okay code, then half decent code, then finally some awesome code that's going to solve the business problem and ascends up to production. Working with databases in a shared environment, you don't have that luxury. First of all, you're doing your dirty washing in public, because while you're testing out and experimenting and trying things out, you're affecting the environment. I would challenge anyone who's worked with a team of people working on a database together to tell me if they've really never encountered a situation somebody comes in the morning and says, "Who's touched my database? Who's changed the database? This was working yesterday."
Right.
It's very, very common. I think people working in teams with databases will recognize this. They tell us that they recognize this in our surveys and our research. So getting out of that situation is good for team health, it's good for happiness, and it's good as well as being good for productivity.
It's quite interesting. It reminds me, actually, I was speaking at an event recently, and I got talking to a small group of attendees afterwards, and we were talking about the time that it takes to get development environments up and running again after terrible mistakes. So, this guy actually worked in a dedicated model. They had a database each. But he was describing a situation to me where he said that the team was scared of making big changes. The team didn't want to make huge changes because they knew that if they had to request a fresh development database, then they'd have to raise a ticket. That would go through a process with a whole bunch of controls in place to make sure that the new environment that was being made available for them met certain criteria. And this could take 2 or 3 days for him to have a new development database. But of course, I guess what you're suggesting here is that if a shared development database breaks and it takes 3-4 days to get a fresh copy of it, then that's a whole team who's not working, rather than just one individual waiting for a new database.
That's right. Yeah, I certainly recognise that pain, and I can recall standing around in a live trading environment when we had a production fault. We had to restore a copy of a database and keep resetting it in order to work through. Now, for us, it wasn't 2 or 3 days; it was 45 minutes to restore a copy of the production database that had this fault that we had to get to the bottom of.
Yeah.
But each time, we were being asked by traders wanting to place trades in the market, when's it going to be ready? And
45 minutes is an eternity.
It's beyond eternity. They would say, how long till, and I would say 45 minutes, and they say 45 minutes till it's all fixed. I say, no, 45 minutes till we can try the next scenario. That wasn't very popular in that moment.
Goodness me. Okay. So it's clear then, I guess, why dedicated environments are desirable. We've got the removal of that fear of conflicting with our colleagues' work, that freedom to experiment. We can try things that we wouldn't normally have done, and as we've kind of touched upon, we've got this easier diagnosis. But of course, the downside of these dedicated development environments is exactly those points, those costs that we're talking about when we discuss provisioning. So, for every copy of the database that we require, we're going to need equal amount of resources to support that copy. We're going to need the time to create those environments, which, as you said, 45 minutes doesn't sound like a huge amount of time. But actually, in some situations, 45 minutes could be an eternity. Mm-hmm. And for many, many organizations, it's much worse than that kind of 45 minutes. So I guess we've touched upon some of the problems largely associated to the cost. What I'd like to do now is run a quick poll with you guys in the audience, if I may. So we have, just let me select this poll. What's your biggest blocker to provisioning databases outside of production? So there's a few options on the screen now. I really appreciate your input. It'd be great to hear exactly what challenges you guys are facing on a day-to-day basis. So we'll just pause briefly just for you to make a selection there. There's a few percent left who haven't picked an option yet. Come on, guys, I'm waiting for you. Okay, so it's interesting. There's a relatively even split. I mean, Richard, what do you make of these results that are coming through right now?
Well, yeah, storage is a blocker, and it's so that's standing out in front at the moment. I think that's understandable, but I wonder if that's going to change over time. We've got I don't mean this poll. People's view on it. I wonder if we should do this again after the GDPR hits in May 2018. And see what the distribution is like then. I imagine it might be slightly different. But yeah, absolutely. The first thing that's going to get in your way is I can't get the disk space. And we hear sometimes we'll hear talking to people at the conferences at a booth go, yeah, I can go to Radio Shack, I can buy a disk for X.
Sure.
That's not quite the same as making it available in the right configuration to your SQL Server instance, and especially when you're being asked to prioritize production, as every business will ask you to.
Yes, of course. I guess. I mean, the thing is, you want a similar environment as possible to be making these changes.
You might want it, but you've got to make a business case for spending the money on it, and these are two different matters. So a lot of people are fighting. They've got other priorities. They might be defending and progressing their DevOps journey. They might be, there's lots of other things you can worry about. And if you don't do this ahead of time. I mean, I remember having a testing environment that was basically the old web server from a few years ago with a single disk.
Wow.
So that's not going to match the distribution of disks that you've got in your production SQL Server state, hopefully.
Yeah. Well, so.
Otherwise, you've got bigger problems.
Okay, everybody, thank you so much for your votes in the poll. I'm going to close that poll now. Storage concerns was the number one winner with a pretty even split across the rest of the highlighted options there. So thanks for your input. Really appreciate that. Okay, so we've spoken a little bit about the problems. We've spoken about why we might want to move towards this dedicated approach, which is just one example of a situation where we would need to provision an increased amount of databases. So, Richard, that's very much your history, I guess. That's where you've come from. You've been in the industry. You've had to try and make these things possible. But now, if we kind of flip to today, it's your job now to make sure that we can fix these problems with Redgate SQL Clone, right?
Yes, absolutely. So Redgate's been in this business for 18 years, speaking to people with trying to understand their problems around SQL Server, the problems that aren't fixed, aren't easily resolved by the platform itself. And it's very often in this sort of team interaction, this solving problems that mostly impact people at the team level that we're seeing, ever more need. So database provisioning is absolutely one of these. Managing the data estate is more important than ever.
Yep.
The number of environments is increasing. Database size is increasing. Numbers of databases are increasing. We're continuously surveying people, of course. We've seen a sharp uptick, possibly related to people moving to service-oriented architectures and microservices.
Yeah.
That people are managing more databases in more environments with more data at the same time as these regulatory pressures are starting to mount.
That's really interesting, actually, because I remember a time when the majority of customers that I was working with were telling me about how they're trying to consolidate, how they're trying to reduce the number of databases, reduce the number of servers. But you're quite right. Recently, it's an ever increasing number. It's more and more and more.
It's a separation out of concern. So the monoliths are being broken up in order to allow us to deliver incremental changes at increasing velocity. And one of the enablers for that is there's breaking the monoliths up into the separate concerns, so that changes can be made with the minimum amount of impact, minimum amount of dependency on other systems.
Sure. Okay, so let's talk about SQL Clone then as a solution for this problem that we've identified. I mean, I've introduced it to some of the Redgate customers that I work with, and they love it. I mean, I almost get accused of witchcraft when I show it to them. So in the words of the product manager for it, what is SQL Clone?
SQL Clone is database provisioning. It's virtualization brought to bear on the database provisioning problem. So we're addressing these familiar problems that we have been talking about. So the lack of the lack of disk space, the need to shift data left at the same time as keeping control. From the perspective of the DBA or the IT manager backfilling the DBA role, as I was at one time, it means not getting the tickets anymore. It means allowing the team to self-serve. And not juggling the disk space, but also helping that velocity to happen in a context where we still do need to have control. So
okay.
rather than putting backup files all over the organization, allowing database copies to be sent to four corners of the of the domain. We have a central place where we can take control of the images that can then be delivered as SQL Clone databases.
Okay, fantastic. And so how does the technology work? I mean, I mentioned that people have accused me of witchcraft because I don't explain it properly. But how does it actually work?
Yeah, so it is virtualization. We're familiar with virtualization principles, I think, across the board. The problem is that virtualization doesn't necessarily happen at the right boundary, in the right context. So if you're lucky enough to have one of these, high-end storage devices, then no doubt you'll know, or at least your sysadmin will know, that you can go in there and you can copy a virtual machine in a relatively efficient way. Possibly you can copy disks, but what you're not keeping control of and monitoring over time is databases themselves.
These solutions that you're talking about, though, they're typically quite large and quite expensive, right? I mean, these are big.
Yeah, this is high-end stuff. So the large wealthy. Okay, I work for a hedge fund, so they had this stuff. But even then, and we also sell, as you know, because you're selling it to them half the time. We also sell to a lot of financial services organizations. It's not just that they don't have the ability to copy a collection of resources. It's that the collection is the wrong size for the work that people working with databases actually want to do. So we're using the virtualization that's built into 64-bit Windows. This is volume shadow copy and the virtual disk service.
Okay.
And we can use those in order to take something that we call a data image. So an image is a point-in-time copy of a SQL Server database. You can start with a backup file. We support differential backups, stripe backups, right. .back native, or Redgate's SQL Backup Pro format. Or you can point at a live database. You're preparing an image for reuse. So this image is, it's a representation. It is the bytes on disk. So that takes about the same amount of time as running a backup.
Okay, so we can see on the slide here that a 2 terabyte SQL Server database relates to a 2 terabyte data image. Now the 2 terabytes here is that just as an example? I mean, is there a limitation that we're having to work with here?
That's just an example. We actually go up to 64 terabytes.
Okay, wow.
But in that example, so the data image is created. It takes the same amount of time as the backup, and then the clones are isolated copies created from the data image, but without moving data. We no longer need to move any data because we can use these features of the Windows virtualization services in order to stand up a database which is actually a virtual mount point and a differencing disk referencing those same bytes that we've already moved.
Okay, and so because it's such the differencing file effectively is next to nothing when it's first created, and that's why it happens so quickly.
That's right. Yeah, we're not shoveling bytes from one place to the other anymore.
Okay, excellent. Okay, fantastic. Well, Richard, I understand you've prepared a short demonstration so that we can see this technology in action today.
Yeah, let me just check on the switching over to that. So if I jump in here, excuse me, the segue. Okay, so here we see SQL Clone. We see the SQL Clone dashboard. I hope everyone can see that okay. Do shout in the comments if you can't. This is the SQL Clone dashboard. We have this is the web interface to SQL Clone. It also has a PowerShell interface. You know, PowerShell is a first-class concern for SQL Clone because we know it's for people who want to automate at times. You often want to move that image creation step is often something that you'll want to put into your maintenance window, possibly after your backups are finished, because that is the one time when you actually are moving bytes around.
Yeah, and it's still just as expensive at that point.
At that point, it's like creating another backup. You're committing those bytes to SQL Clone, and it's storing it on a regular Windows file share. There's nothing special, no special storage that required for that. I'll just show that workflow. I'm aware some people might have seen this demo before, so I'll just do a very quick run through of the two steps that are involved, and then I'll show a workflow that is a bit more realistic, that involves pushing some large database clones out to a team of developers.
Okay.
So the short version is, as we see, I can use a backup or collection of backup files. In this case, I'm going to take the short option, as is probably a good idea for a demo. I have SQL Server instances that have been registered against my SQL Clone server. And I'm going to take a small database just so that I can show the concept. I'm going to put this into a folder that has been given to me. Big Vol1 is just a very basic Windows file share on a box of disks that is in the corner of a data center somewhere.
This is a fantastically straightforward UI. It looks almost impossible to get lost in here.
So we're creating of that small. This is a small database just to show the concept. We're moving those bytes into a regular Windows file share. While that's happening, and it shouldn't take too long because we're looking at quite a small database there. I'll just show a couple of other points on here. So inside the settings, we can see the machines that I have registered against this SQL Clone server. These are auto-updating, by the way. You don't need to, once you've installed the agents, there's a very small piece of software that sits on each SQL Server instance.
Okay.
You don't need to put them on production. Because we can work from backup files, this can be completely isolated from production.
That was my number one question. Do I have to install on production?
You do not, no.
Okay.
As long as you can get access to a backup file, then you can be entirely isolated from production. And there's no dependency back. Unlike, say, snapshotting. Some people tried to, provision using snapshots a few years ago, and it was potentially quite nasty because it'll put load back onto your production system.
Yeah.
And there's we have permission sets on who can perform the operations on here. Let's go back and see this image has been created. A very small image. It took the amount of time a backup takes. If we have a look at a slightly bigger image, we can see that this one, my trades data mart, all my examples come from foreign exchange, you'll see, because that's where I worked for many years. This is a 3.7 terabyte database, and I delivered earlier today into my dev laptop, which I can tell you has about 10 gigabytes of disk space free, a clone of that database, and that's a fully functional, fully operational database. So we'll have a quick look at that. There's my clone of the trades data mart, and I can see the databases involved in that. I looked on the views there. If I have a look inside, the database, this is the queries executed something. There's potential for lag because we're accessing a little bit of the data across the network connection.
But this is on your dev laptop, right? This is 3.1 terabyte.
It is working with a 3.7 terabyte database.
Wow.
Let me just work through a scenario here where I've got a bit of PowerShell. So if we just have a look at what the PowerShell is, very straightforward. There's the getting started guides. There are worked examples for most of the things that you want to do. If you don't see an example, then give us a shout. Ask in the forums on the Redgate Hub.
Okay.
We're happy to put some worked examples together for you. And in this case, I'm just going to connect to my SQL Clone server, and I'm going to query the images, the SQL Server instances that have registered. So when I run that connection, maybe it'll help to zoom in slightly. In the next thing I'm going to do is run a query to get the SQL Server instances which are connected to my SQL Clone server, and I'm going to filter that with a simple bit of a simple filter script operation on where object. So I'm looking for the server property being like WKS and the instance name being the same as dev. Now let me just switch back quickly to my list of machines, and you'll see that there are 3 workstations that match that filter.
1, 2, and 3.
1, 2, and 3. So my scenario, we've come out of the room with the product owner, somebody who wants this change to happen. My business analyst says we've got to get this out there by, we're working in double quick time. Let's get everybody up to date with a fresh copy of the trades data mart that we took last night, and we'll push that out to the workstations. So if I move back to this view, there I had my one existing clone. What I'm going to do is run this batch. A little bit of PowerShell. You could put this inside, inside something else, inside wherever you kick your workflow off from.
Sure.
We know that people want flexibility, so we give them the interface rather than dictating that they work it in a particular way.
Mm-hmm.
And so this operation of creating a virtual mount point and creating a differencing disk is now happening on those 3 workstations.
In parallel, right? This is all happening
this is happening in parallel, just because I told the PowerShell script to do it in parallel. Right. So that's pretty straightforward to do in PowerShell. And the operation is not moving bytes around. It's calling the virtual disk service, and it's saying, can you create a differencing disk? The first one's pinged in there. These are 3 different workstations, so they might be responding at slightly different rates. But I'm done. I now have developer on workstation number 3 is now ready to start using that database.
And that's 78.6 megabytes. That's the size of the differencing disk?
That's right. That's all the space that it's taking up right now on that workstation.
And so as quick as that, we now have 3 copies of this development database ready to go.
And they're isolated. So if I connect to one of those, let's have a look at the this workstation number 1. I'll expand the databases node, refresh that, and we can see that the thing that I just created is now available for me to start work.
It's fantastic.
And as before, my queries execute. Now there's we've got customers doing this effectively, that same workflow for for a large number of workstations.
So I was going to ask actually about customers. So I mean, this is obviously absolutely fantastic. But is there anybody that you've worked closely with who really has a great story off the back of using this technology?
Yeah, well, I'd encourage if people are curious to have a look at the case studies on our website. Ahmed at Payment Sense has done a very exciting DevOps implementation, I think, using SQL Clone. They have developers working in pairs. They have, I think, when I visited, I think they had about 18 or 19 separate environments. Wow. Into which clone databases from last night's production databases are being delivered. As I say, you can read more on the case study on the website. There are other case studies there from Moody's. This has been a real DevOps enabler. It isn't. So for some, it's a DevOps enabler. There's other people with some other interesting use cases, but this is where it's really shone for Payment Sense anyway.
It's easy to see how you can start making immediate gains. Really, I mean, you're practically taking that time and reducing it down to nothing. I mean, normally you see these figures of cutting time and by 99%, and you think it's farcical, but actually, you've evidence right there, 3.77 terabytes in just a few seconds. So I think it's a terrific technology. Everybody I've introduced it to has been hugely excited by it. And there's some wonderful use cases that, as you say, I'm sure we'll be sharing more and more regularly on the website. But it is interesting, you touched on there about it being a DevOps enabler. And of course, Redgate's view of DevOps is not confined just to this provisioning space. In fact, we provide tooling and support across many different areas of DevOps. So if we look at the cog that we see on the screen here at the moment, this is our broader scope when we're talking about database DevOps. And you can see that this provisioning part is just one tiny piece in that whole picture. It touches, of course, based upon what Richard's described here on our approach to development and also to validation and test. Being able to create those testing environments tremendously quickly has obvious benefits too. But actually, it's interesting that Redgate's experience in the world of database DevOps. So we've recently published the database DevOps report, which was based off of the results from a survey that was conducted by over 1,000 respondents, and it was really quite easy for us to identify some of the topics that you've talked about in organizations that are performing really well against their DevOps objectives. And so I don't know how many of you have already seen this, but off the back of that report, actually Redgate put together the database DevOps maturity framework. And what that does is splits the database DevOps subject area into three main categories: environments and development, continuous integration and deployment, and protecting and preserving data. And in each of those areas, we have identified characteristics that indicate organizations that are performing either higher or lower on the scale. And a couple of the interesting ones that come out, particularly in the environments and development practices, relate to these exact topics that we've been talking about. So when we look at environments and development practices, one of the things that jumped out was the way that environments are provisioned. So people who are early on in their DevOps journey and perhaps haven't got quite as richer processes in place and are performing less well against their DevOps-based objectives, we see that those are the teams that are actually still provisioning those environments in that manual, time-consuming, labor-heavy way, I guess. But actually, those who are performing much more higher and who we would consider advanced on this scale, those are the teams that are embracing that automatic provisioning that we've discussed. So based upon that, I mean, I'm really keen to hear the points of view of the audience. So I'm going to run our second poll of the webinar, which really is about this particular area. How mature do you think your provisioning process is? Are you at the beginner level where you're still provisioning these environments manually, or have you taken those steps to move yourself up towards the more advanced level on the scale here, where you have full automation, or perhaps somewhere in the middle there? I'm just going to pause for a moment just while we get those results in. Richard, just while we're waiting for those results, talking from your experience and moving from that shared development model that you described to the more appropriate, I think we can agree, dedicated development approach. How long did that take? I mean, that's not something you can do overnight, right?
No, absolutely. It's not a simple landscape either. So I would say the shared model is pretty hard to get rid of in some scenarios.
Right, okay.
So certainly, and it depends what kind of change that you're performing. So, and the amount of teamwork, the amount of collaboration that's taking place. So I'd never achieve that for a BI infrastructure, for example.
Oh, okay.
Like in many organizations, you often find that there's one BI developer or two BI developers.
Yeah.
They work slightly outside the normal model of software development.
Okay.
So the need is perhaps a little bit less. On the other hand, the need is great in terms of disk space.
Sure.
So they've got a special set of problems. The virtualization that was available to me at that time, didn't allow me to perform a SQL Clone-like trick in order to improve my BI workflow.
Right.
I would certainly be doing that now, and
Yeah.
quite a few of our customers, in fact, are doing that. They're in a BI space, which is quite it has its own interesting
Sure.
challenges. So and it varies in terms of the database as well. So I think it is where your environment is changing in lockstep with the application. You've got a slightly different set of challenges to the scenario where you have effectively an operational data store or a data mart where multiple systems are coming together.
Yeah.
They've got a slightly different cadence of change. So it's not a simple answer. I think organizations will come to it, in their own way and in their own time, depending on where the pain point is.
Okay. Excellent. Well, actually, let's close the poll then at this point, and I'll just share these results, and we can see that I guess almost unsurprisingly, you said it's where most people start, that manually provisioning those environments. We need to move those practices up further towards the advanced level, but unsurprising results here, I guess. 60% consider themselves at that beginner end of the scale.
Yep. It's these are difficult challenges, and when they're infrequent, of course, it doesn't feel too painful. But I'd encourage people to think about their ability to accelerate their processes. So if you do perform an operation by clicking and then trying to remember where that script was that you ran, and then checking to make sure it's okay, your ability to become more responsive as a software development team is, I would suggest, probably constrained.
Okay. Well, we touched a bit there on moving from shared to dedicated, and this was another area that was really, really strongly evidenced in that State of DevOps report, and likewise has been translated through to the database DevOps maturity framework. So here again, there was a strong correlation between those organizations who still had that shared development database model in place, and those that were perhaps performing less well against their DevOps-based objectives. Whereas at the other end of the scale, those that were really performing well against those objectives, they were the teams that had those local sandbox, isolated development environments that you said, and where those teams were using source control to share those changes and making sure that they were committed to version control as regularly as possible. So again, I'm going to put this out to the audience. It'd be interesting to see where you guys think you are on this scale. Who's using the shared model? Who's working with those isolated development databases? Please do offer your answers up now. Okay, so some quick results in this time. Everybody's obviously ready with the mouse to click their selected option this time. So a little bit more of a mix here, I guess, that we're seeing coming through. There's still a lean towards the beginner end of the scale, but a few more. Oh, I may have spoke too soon as the rest of the results came in there. So I'm just going to leave this open for just a few more seconds. So if you haven't cast your vote yet, please do now. And then we'll be sharing those results. I'm waiting for one more person. One more person. Okay. Excellent. There we go. Super. Thank you. Thank you very much. So let me share these results with you. So 67% consider themselves at the beginner point here. Only 7% fully transitioned all the way over to that advanced level. Is that surprising, do you think?
I think it's good to see version control is, so if you're a small organization, it's perfectly understandable as a getting started point. But so there is version control is good, is a positive thing. But these things are tricky, and it's until you feel that pain, then it can be quite difficult to bring, as we know, DevOps practices into databases at all.
Indeed.
And this is kind of the next stage. We're calling it intermediate there. To be fair, that's that beginning and intermediate are actually fairly good progress from that base state. But yeah, that's unsurprising. I think as a distribution.
I think the biggest thing for me is working with a lot of Redgate customers. These results are not surprising. I mean, I work with people on a daily basis who find themselves in similar situations, similar positions. But what I think has been evident recently is the desire to make these changes, the real push within organizations to move towards this DevOps approach. And I think that's often, to counteract the increasing threats that we're seeing in a number of these industries, the disruptive technologies, disruptive organizations, particularly, fintech firms and things like that.
There's disruption, but there's also managing threats, having a risk-based approach to how you develop software. So if your changes are ad hoc, if they're dependent upon remembering to do things in the right order at the right time, then I would suggest you're in a more vulnerable position in terms of getting quality software into your production systems and defending yourself against attack from or misuse by employee or misuse by accidents, by accidentally proliferating data, for example, leaving security holes unchecked. I think the incremental small change tested in multiple environments model and tested deterministically according to a process is much more defensible. And it's not just Redgate saying that. If you read the Puppet Lab survey, the others data out there, look at any survey with any amount of volume, look at what McKinsey or PwC are saying development practices ought to be. I saw a McKinsey report recently that has suggested a good DevOps organization probably has about 9 environments. Right. That might be that's quite ambitious, but the point is that this is there is consensus, I think, that this is the direction to go to protect your business.
I think so. I mean, in my experience, regardless of the cause for it, it's happening. It's one of the most common themes that I see coming up time and time again with the organisations that we're working with. So I guess at this point, I'd just like to thank you, Richard, for giving us this presentation today on the SQL Clone technology and also sharing some of your experience and knowledge of this area. It's been delightful to talk to you about this topic, actually. I'm sure people out there have some questions related to this. So I'm going to use our last 6-7 minutes of this session today to open up for questions. Please do feel free to type your questions into the chat window. We will keep the microphones and the audio on mute just so that we've got a clear line, but I'd be happy to read out any questions that you guys have for Richard, or if there's anything I can help with, I'm happy to help too. So I'll just pause for a moment. If you do have a question, please feel free to type one in. Okay, so it looks like we've got the first batch of questions coming through. So, Richard, first one here: Can a clone be used like a real database?
Absolutely. The clone database is the same files that make up your database, but they're mounted through that virtualization technique across, from a network share. So there's the potential for latency. We're always asked this, what is the latency? And our problem is that there is never one straight answer. But the straightest answer we can give is that lots of organizations using clone databases are finding it absolutely acceptable. It's a complex matter because, of course, in theory, you've got some traversing of the network. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, you've got some isolation of memory and processor time to do that query onto the onto the workstation. So it's a very rich landscape if you spend a little bit of time thinking about it. It is a full database. From SQL Server sees a full database. It sees those MDF LDF files. The differences are captured, and that's controlled in the differencing disk, and that's controlled by the virtual disk service. That's very proven, long running Microsoft technology. So. So yeah, it is a real database.
Fantastic.
You might want to think maybe if you're considering doing a full reindex on a large database, you might want to have a little think about the effect that would have on the differencing disk. But for most dev test use cases, it is a full database.
Okay, well, I think the same person has asked a follow-up question, and I will come back to the questions that were asked in between, but following on from that, just for continuity, if that's the case, how can I identify which databases are clones so that I don't back them up, for example?
We hit this very early on, actually, with some of our early customers. So they had one customer called, one of our early customers called us up, who's on the beta program actually, and said, I've just backed up all my SQL Clone databases because I've got a script that says for each database in databases.
Oh, wow.
So there's an extended property on the database called is SQL Clone database. So you'll want to drop that into your script.
Yeah, so we make sure that situation doesn't happen. Okay, so some of the other questions that we're asking between there. So here's an interesting one, Richard. So you touched about desensitizing data and sanitizing data. Mm-hmm. Somebody's asked here, does SQL Clone allow us to mask data?
It doesn't currently have a masking feature built into it.
Okay.
So Redgate are very active and interested in data masking, mm-hmm. To the extent that we recently made an acquisition to jumpstart some of our data masking work. So we had some work underway. We're now taking very much a vNext approach to data masking. We're building kind of the ingeniously simple data masking, which will be absolutely accessible from SQL Clone.
Yeah.
We've also acquired the Net 2000 data masker product, which is very capable, proven in the market data masking solution, which you can integrate into SQL Clone with the PowerShell interface for now. And over the coming months, we'll be tightening up that integration and making that a smooth experience.
Okay.
But come and talk to us about data masking. We've got an offering through the acquisition just now that we can talk to you about, and we're very active in making that a seamless part of your workflow.
So what you're saying is it's possible right now, yes, with the Redgate broader solution, but they're not part of the same product right now.
They're not right now. We're working on those integrations, and of course, many people have their own scripts. So one of the features coming very soon in SQL Clone is the ability to run your own script to perform the masking, the permission reset, the change of configuration data that might be in your database. So watch this space. That's kind of under active development at the moment.
Excellent. Sounds great. So we've got time for one or two more questions. There's another one here, Richard. What about Azure?
It doesn't work with so Azure SQL Database, the platform as a service offering from Microsoft, doesn't allow any management of its disks, of its storage.
Right.
So we at the moment we can't apply that SQL Clone approach to Azure SQL Database.
But a virtual machine.
Yeah, exactly. So virtual machines work very nicely. So the infrastructure as a service approach, it works very nicely indeed, and we've got some demos worked up in Azure Dev Test Labs. Which is a nice, inexpensive way of testing whether that's going to be the appropriate environment. We're seeing an increasing number of organizations. We've been speaking to Microsoft about this. They tell us they're seeing a really good uptake in the model whereby you take development to Azure first, and you work in an environment like Dev Test Labs, because you can scale cheaply. You can familiarize yourself with some of the techniques of stopping and starting virtual machines, of provisioning, of configuring them. So it does work very nicely in Azure. You can put the image storage in Azure, and again, that's something we're actively looking at. If you'd so anyone interested in that space, so the question, come and talk to us about it. Jump on the forums and the Redgate Hub, and we'll get straight back to you, because we really want to speak to customers about that space.
Fantastic. Sounds great. And you mentioned there you had some examples using Dev Test Labs. Are they documented? Are they online, or should people contact?
They really should be. That's a good point. Well made. I should put them online in the near future.
But for now, if people contact us on the SQL Clone email address, then we can share some assistance.
Absolutely. Yeah. We're a responsive team.
Fantastic. That is wonderful to hear. So, final question, because we are just about out of time, but I think we can squeeze one more in. Richard, is it possible to clone a clone? Wow, this could get complicated. Clone a clone.
Right. Right now, yeah, you can clone a clone
Okay.
because SQL Server sees a full database. So that would really mean creating an image from a clone.
Okay, yep.
And SQL, when we perform that operation just now in SQL Clone, it would create another image from that clone that would then be available for further cloning. This is another area where there are things we could bring to bear on that. There are technologies that where that if we see that use case in demand, that I want to check. I've been working on a clone. Now I want to make this slightly different version available. There are things that we can do there. There's a technique called VHD chaining that we might be able to implement. So that's something again that's come and talk to us. And
sounds like there's a rich roadmap ahead. Is that fair to say?
It's a rich space.
Excellent.
Database provisioning, and I think there's plenty more we can do.
Brilliant, fantastic. Well, everybody, thank you so much for giving up your time today. Richard, thanks again for joining me to speak to everybody about SQL Clone. Just to finish this up, you'll see on the screen I have put that SQL Clone email address, sqlclone@red-gate.com. If you do have any other questions or you'd like to follow up on any of the topics or materials that we've touched upon today, please do get in touch. And if you're interested in Redgate's wider database DevOps solution, then by all means head over to www.red-gate.com/solutions. So that's it from us today. Thank you very much and goodbye.